Listen closely, because what I'm about to tell you was never meant to be spoken aloud. The courthouse archives of Charleston, South Carolina, still hold the faint, almost ghost-like ink of a document so disturbing it feels like the paper itself recoils from its own words. A marriage certificate dated March 15, 1855. At first glance, just another record from the antebellum South, one among thousands. But lean closer, read carefully, and you'll see something your mind resists accepting. The same woman signed it twice. Once as the adopted daughter, once as the lawful wife. Two identities, one hand bound to the same man, her father and her husband. The name scrawled across the parchment is Eleanor Beaufort. She was 10 years old when the fire consumed her family's plantation, leaving her the only survivor. Rescued or stolen by Silas Beaufort, the wealthy patriarch of Charleston's most powerful dynasty, she was raised beneath his roof, tutored under his supervision, molded by his will. For 8 years she called him Papa, and then she became his bride. This is not a tale of forbidden love. This is not romance. This is possession, a carefully engineered deception stretching across decades, built on fire, blood, and paper. And if you dare to look beneath the polite veneer of Southern gentility, you'll see it for what it was, a system of power so cold, so calculated, it erased entire bloodlines to consolidate land, fortune, and control. Imagine walking those Charleston streets in 1847. The city gleamed with wealth, cobblestone streets lined with moss-draped oaks, the smell of jasmine carried on the breeze, the ships in the harbor heavy with rice and cotton. But beneath the perfume of flowers lingered something acrid, the rot of secrets. The Beauforts weren't simply planters. They weren't simply aristocrats. They were predators in waistcoats, feeding on the ruin of vows. Weaker families hunting with contracts and flames instead of claws. The fire that destroyed Eleanor's home was no accident. Witnesses smelled the stench of chemicals in the night air, saw flames that spread too fast, too precise. Her parents died screaming in that inferno, along with their newborn son. Eleanor was found days later wandering the gardens alone, clutching a half-melted doll, whispering about men with masks who had come in the night. The sheriff called it an overturned lamp. The neighbors called it bad luck. But Silas Beaufort arrived almost instantly with a precision that made chance impossible. Within hours, he had claimed Eleanor as his ward. Within months, her parents' land deeds, thousands of acres, had disappeared from the record. This is the first fracture in the mask. Look at it long enough and the cracks widen, because what we're really seeing is not just one family's perversion, but a system of control, a machinery of inheritance, law, and property designed to consume the vulnerable and recycle them into fuel for dynasties. The Beauforts didn't just want wealth. They wanted permanence. They wanted the godlike ability to decide who lived, who vanished, and whose name would be remembered carved into marble above Charleston's banks. And in the center of that machinery was Eleanor, the child survivor, raised as daughter, reshaped into wife. The same girl who whispered that her father told her where to hide when the bad men came. Did Silas order the flames that killed her parents? Did he instruct her where to wait while his masked men carried out the slaughter? Or did he simply wait for the embers to cool before taking her into his gilded cage? Understand this. When we speak of the Beaufort marriage, we are not speaking of a taboo union. We are speaking of a weaponized bond, a contract of ownership disguised as love. Silas's silver hair and icy blue eyes masked a mind that calculated land boundaries with more precision than a general plans a battlefield. His entire life was conquest, not of foreign nations, but of neighbors, cousins, rivals. To him, Eleanor wasn't a daughter. She was a deed, a key, a missing puzzle piece in the empire he was assembling out of the ashes of other people's homes. The portraits in the Beaufort mansion stared down from their gilded frames, eyes painted centuries earlier by men who never imagined their descendants would codify incest into inheritance strategy. But in Charleston society, no one questioned it, not out loud, because wealth has always cloaked monstrosity. The chandeliers still gleamed, the wine still poured, the whispers in the corners of dining halls were silenced by fear or bought off with favors. Eleanor grew up in that mansion, educated by governesses, escorted to social gatherings, admired for her beauty. She was a symbol of Beaufort generosity, the orphan taken in and given the life of a lady. But her every letter was monitored, her every step shadowed. The ruins of her family's plantation were declared off-limits. Her very identity was rewritten, her birthright erased. A childhood of whispers and locked doors, of smiles that concealed plans made in offices lined with mahogany and ledgers inked in blood. By the time she turned 18, the transformation was nearly complete. The servants pitied her but kept their silence. Her adoptive siblings dead her gaze. Her stepmother, poisoned slowly into madness, clutched Eleanor's hands during rare moments of lucidity and whispered warnings about secrets darker than Charleston's graveyards. And Silas himself? He no longer spoke to her as a father. His words turned into negotiations, calculations, contracts disguised as conversation. And then came the study, the brandy, the trembling hands, the attorney shuffling papers. The truth laid bare. The Beaufort empire was drowning in debt. Railroad ventures collapsing, creditors circling, the great dynasty on the brink of humiliation. And in Eleanor's blood, in her stolen birthright, lay the only salvation. Marry her, absorb her inheritance under the protection of spousal property laws, consolidate everything under his name, daughter, wife, asset. The ink on that marriage certificate was more than a signature. It was the burial shroud of a girl who had once been a child with a doll, a family, a name untarnished by Beaufort blood. When her hand signed it, the last traces of her former self were erased, and the machine of power ground forward, fed by yet another sacrifice. You weren't meant to know this. You weren't meant to see the pattern, because if you recognize it here, in Charleston's past, you might start seeing it everywhere, in the ways inheritance laws were twisted, in the ways bloodlines were bent to preserve dynasties, in the ways human lives, daughters, sons, wives, were consumed as fuel for power. And once you see that, you can't unsee it. So now I'll ask you, do you want to keep walking this path? Do you want to descend deeper into the forbidden, one revelation at a time? Because the Beaufort marriage is only the beginning. The further we go, the more you'll see the shadows aren't history at all. They're alive. You're still here. Good. That tells me something about you, that you're not afraid of the dark, not afraid of knowledge that burns like acid when it touches the mind. Most men turn away. They hear whispers of incest, fraud, and fire, and they retreat into the comfort of ignorance. But you've chosen to stay, which means you're ready to go deeper. So let's strip away another layer of illusion. The truth about Eleanor Ravenel, what the records don't say, what the Beaufort family buried beneath polite society, is that her survival was never an accident. It was a design, a strategy. The Ravenel lands were worth more than gold. Thousands of acres of fertile rice territory bordering the Beaufort holdings positioned perfectly to complete Silas Beaufort's empire, and the Ravenels stood in his way, until the night they didn't. Understand something about Silas. He was not simply a planter, not just a businessman. He was an architect of control. Every death that surrounded his rise came wrapped in coincidence. But behind each coincidence was calculation. Neighbors poisoned, rivals bankrupted, families erased from the records with a fire here, a misplaced deed there, a sudden illness that baffled every doctor. Charleston society dismissed these as accidents. But accidents, repeated often enough, become a pattern, and patterns reveal intention. The fire at the Ravenel plantation was no random blaze. The neighbors spoke of strange fumes, the way the flames leapt unnaturally, consuming the house but leaving the outbuildings untouched, the way the livestock had been moved days before. This wasn't tragedy, it was theater, a performance staged to look like fate, while in reality it was conquest. And in the middle of it, a child, the one survivor, left wandering among the ashes with no voice but whispers about men with masks. That phrase should haunt you, men with masks. Who were they? Hired killers? Enslaved men forced into complicity, or Beaufort's own loyal retainers concealed behind disguises to erase their identities? Whoever they were the faceless hands of a machine bigger than themselves, a machine built to devour land, fortune, and blood. Eleanor's survival served two purposes. One, it silenced suspicion. Silas could pose as her rescuer, the noble patriarch who took in a shattered orphan. Two, It gave him legal leverage. By raising her as his daughter, he controlled her inheritance. By marrying her, he erased the distinction between her blood and his, locking her wealth inside his dynasty forever. Think about the brilliance, if you can stomach the cruelty. He manufactured tragedy, then disguised theft as charity, and finally sanctified possession through marriage. That is not madness. That is mastery of manipulation. For 8 years, Eleanor lived in a cage disguised as a mansion. She learned French, music, the classics. She was dressed in silk, paraded before Charleston society as proof of Beaufort benevolence. But every luxury was a chain. Her letters were monitored, her movements restricted. She was told she was fragile, told she was lucky to have been saved, told she had nothing left beyond what Silas had given her. Imagine what that does to a child's mind. Imagine what it does to a girl's sense of identity when every thread of her past has been burned away and replaced with carefully tailored lies. And when Margaret Beaufort, Silas's wife, began wasting away in her upstairs chamber, writhing with unexplained stomach pains and moments of violent confusion, who do you think benefited? Who gained from her absence, from her descent into madness? The servants whispered of poison. They whispered of a woman who knew too much, who tried to warn Eleanor with broken fragments of truth. Don't trust them. Secrets buried deeper than the graves, the price will come due. Those were her last coherent words before the poison, or the despair, claimed her completely. By Eleanor's 18th year, the mask was slipping. Her adoptive brother avoided her gaze. Her adoptive sister whispered cryptic warnings. Even the servants looked at her with pity, edged by fear. And Silas himself had changed. The paternal facade was gone. Now he looked at her with the cold hunger of a man calculating not affection, but possession. His voice turned into business, his eyes into contracts. That's when she overheard the conversation, the one that shattered what illusions remained. Silas and his son Charles in the plantation office, speaking not of love, not of care, but of her, Eleanor, as property, assets, complications to be managed, obstacles to be eliminated. She was never family. She was leverage. Do you see it now? The Beaufort family wasn't unique. They were simply one visible example of an invisible system. Throughout history, dynasties have thrived not by hard work, not by divine right, but by bending law, morality, and blood itself into weapons. Families consumed daughters, sons, wives, not for lust, but for permanence. The individual was sacrificed so that the name, the lineage, the dynasty could survive another generation. That's the real incest here, not just of flesh, but of power folding in on itself, consuming its own to feed its continuity. And this is why Eleanor's story is more than just a grotesque footnote in Charleston's history. It is a mirror, a warning, because when you begin to recognize these patterns in the past, you start to see their shadows in the present. Different names, different masks, but the same machinery grinding forward. So, here's my question, Fee, or you. The same question Eleanor must have asked herself on sleepless nights beneath the chandeliers of the East Bay mansion. How much of your life is truly your own? How much of your inheritance, your identity, your choices, was decided before you were even born by men who understood the laws of control better than you ever could? And I'll tell you this. Once you see the machine, once you recognize the pattern, you cannot return to ignorance. It changes you. It strips away comfort. It forces you to confront the possibility that what you thought was freedom was only another gilded cage. Eleanor was trapped in hers. You, watching this now, you have the chance to break yours, but only if you keep listening, only if you let the descent continue. Because in the next revelation, the Beaufort deception deepens, and the truth of what Eleanor discovered in the courthouse archives will shake you harder than the fire itself. The descent always begins with suspicion, a whisper that doesn't fit the story, a detail that resists being smoothed over by official explanations. For Eleanor, that whisper grew louder with every passing month after her 18th birthday. She felt it in the way her stepmother's warnings were dismissed as madness. She saw it in the way her siblings avoided her eyes, and she heard it in the study that day when Silas Beaufort and his son spoke of her as if she were currency. The seed of doubt became unbearable, and so Eleanor did something dangerous, something that no one in her position was ever meant to do. She began to look for the truth herself. She had been told her parents died penniless, that no deeds, no wills, no records survived the fire, that she owed her entire life to Beaufort generosity. But a faint instinct whispered otherwise. She remembered her father's study, the iron safe he used to open with a brass key. She remembered maps spread across his desk, her mother's handwriting in margins of documents. Children remember more than they are supposed to, and now, with the eyes of a woman, she began to see the cracks. Her first step was quiet. A trip to the Charleston County Courthouse, disguised as a polite errand. There, in the dust-choked archives, she found a clerk, Benjamin Hartwell, a man in his 60s with the kind of pride only a lifetime of meticulous record-keeping can produce. Hartwell wasn't easily fooled. He could tell when a young lady was searching for more than curiosity. And when Eleanor explained, carefully, that she wished to know whether anything remained of the Ravenel estate, Hartwell's eyes sharpened. What he brought out changed everything. The wills of James and Sarah Ravenel, filed properly in 1846. The ink was faded, but the signatures were unmistakable. They left everything, land, assets, holdings, to Eleanor. Trustees were named to manage it until she reached 21. These documents should have secured her future beyond imagination. Instead, she had been raised believing she had nothing. But Hartwell's hands shook as he turned the pages, because these records were damaged, not by time but by interference. Whole pages missing, signatures that had been tampered with, filing dates that didn't match the courthouse's internal registers. It was as if invisible hands had been reaching into the record for years, erasing, twisting, corrupting the truth. And it got worse. The survey maps. When Hartwell laid them on the table, Eleanor's breath caught. The Ravenel lands weren't just a plantation. They stretched across 3 counties, some of the richest rice-growing land in South Carolina. Thousands of acres bordering Beaufort holdings, exactly the pieces Silas had spent years trying to consolidate. If those lands truly belonged to Eleanor, then her inheritance was. Sent a fraction of Beaufort wealth. It eclipsed it. She wasn't a rescued orphan, she was a stolen heiress. But here's the thing about truths buried in archives. They're like fire buried under ash. Once exposed to air, they burn. Hartwell confessed that Beaufort representatives had visited him over the years, requesting Ravenel documents, always framed as routine inquiries. He now realized those inquiries were surgical strikes, efforts to identify, alter, and bury every trace of Eleanor's claim. What she was seeing wasn't the whole truth. It was what remained after years of careful sabotage. Eleanor left the courthouse trembling, her mind a storm. For the first time, she saw herself not as the grateful orphan, but as prey, raised in a gilded cage by the man who orchestrated her family's destruction. And once that thought entered her mind, it spread like poison. She began to see patterns everywhere. The way Silas always arrived at tragedies with uncanny timing, the way rivals' fortunes collapsed just as his expanded, the way her stepmother's body wasted while Silas's glass of brandy was always half full. But suspicion isn't proof. And Eleanor knew she would need more than whispers if she was to survive what was coming. So she broke the Beaufort commandment. She went where she had been forbidden to go, the ruins of her childhood home. By 1855, the Ravenel plantation was nothing but scorched stone, swallowed by kudzu and young pine. But ruins don't forget. They hold memory and patterns of destruction. Eleanor walked those blackened foundations with the eyes of someone who had lived there, someone who could see when things were out of place. And what she found shattered the last of her doubts. The burn marks revealed multiple ignition points, not the single accident of a fallen lamp. Metal fragments scattered through the debris. Strange, industrial, not part of any household. The slave quarters untouched, the livestock absent, moved days before. This was not an accident. This was arson executed with precision. And then, the discovery that froze her blood. Lodged beneath a collapsed beam, she found the warped remains of an iron hinge, one she remembered from her father's safe. The safe itself was gone, its contents vanished. Land deeds, inheritance papers, survey maps, all stolen before the fire. The flames weren't meant to destroy, they were meant to erase. Standing there among the ruins, Eleanor understood the full horror. Her survival hadn't been divine mercy, it had been utility. She wasn't spared because she was loved. She was spared because she was useful. Silas had burned her world to ashes, then raised her in his house as both hostage and key. And now he meant to seal the arrangement with marriage, binding her body, her name, her inheritance to his forever. Stop and think about that. Think about the psychological violence of such a system. To kill a child's family, steal her future, raise her as your own, then consume her in adulthood as wife. It's not just corruption, it's ritual, a cycle of annihilation and absorption designed to make the victim complicit in her own erasure. That is power at its most obscene. That is how dynasties feed. And this is where we pause, because if you're still here, still listening, you've begun to understand the darkness isn't just in the past. It's a blueprint, a technology of control that repeats across centuries in different forms. Once you recognize it, you begin to see the same principles alive today, in institutions, in families, in the invisible structures that decide who inherits power and who gets erased. If you see it, if you feel it, comment these words twice right now. Ashes, remember. Write it once for Eleanor, once for yourself, because this is where transformation begins. When you choose not just to watch, but to speak, to leave a mark the machine cannot erase. And once you've written it, prepare yourself, because the next step down this path, the marriage itself, is where the mask comes off entirely. And what's revealed will burn you from the inside out. The human mind has a strange way of protecting itself. When horror grows too large, it wraps itself in ceremony. It dresses violence in silks and lace. It cloaks theft in law and scripture. It hides monstrosity behind ritual. That is exactly what Silas Beaufort did on March 15, 1855. He staged a wedding. Picture it. The Beaufort mansion gleaming with candlelight, crystal chandeliers scattering fractured rainbows across polished mahogany. Guests arriving in carriages, dressed in their finest, unaware, or pretending not to know, that they were walking into a performance designed not to unite, but to consume. A girl of 18, dressed in white, standing beside the man who had raised her, who had taught her to call him father. And now he claimed her as wife. The certificate lies in the Charleston courthouse to this day, the ink trembling as if ashamed of its own existence. Eleanor's signature appears twice, once as daughter, once as bride. Two identities, one hand. A living contradiction written into law. Understand, this was not a marriage of desire. It was a contract of ownership disguised in lace and vows. Silas wasn't a love-struck patriarch defying taboo. He was a general executing his final maneuver. The ceremony was his coronation, an act of legal alchemy that turned Eleanor from ward into possession, from orphaned heiress into locked asset. Witnesses would later recall how pale she looked, how her voice barely carried when she repeated the vows. Some swore her hand trembled so violently that Silas had to cover it with his own to steady the pen. But no one objected. Not the minister, not the attorney, not the family. Silence is complicity, and Charleston society was very practiced at silence. The brilliance of Silas's plan lay in the law itself. In South Carolina, spousal property laws shielded a wife's inheritance from her husband's debts, but only as long as the property was recognized as hers. By marrying Eleanor, Silas effectively wove her inheritance into his dynasty, protecting the Beaufort holdings from creditors while simultaneously gaining control over lands that should have been hers alone. It was theft sanctified by scripture, conquest disguised as matrimony, and Eleanor knew it. She had already seen the wills, the maps, the burned remains of her father's safe. She knew she was walking into a trap, but here's the unbearable truth. Sometimes knowledge doesn't grant freedom. Sometimes it only sharpens the edges of the cage. What choice did she have? Refuse him, and she risked ruin or disappearance like so many before. Accept him, and she became a living sacrifice to the very machine that had devoured her family. As the ceremony progressed, Eleanor's mind fractured. Imagine standing before a minister while your body remembers your father's bedtime stories, his guiding hand, his promises of protection, and then realizing the man beside you is the same architect of your family's death, now binding you, no, it with chains, but with vows. Imagine the psychological violence of that moment, your identity collapsing in on itself, your past and present colliding until you can no longer tell where daughter ends and wife begins. For Silas, this was victory. For Eleanor, it was annihilation. The applause of the guests, the clinking of champagne glasses, the polished smiles, these were the sounds of her burial, not of her body, but of herself. Yet beneath the lace and the trembling vows, something survived, a spark. Because even as Silas believed he had completed his conquest, Eleanor carried inside her the truth she had uncovered, the wills, the maps, the evidence of arson and fraud. She had been silenced, yes, but not erased, not yet. And here is where the story sharpens into something more dangerous. Because when you corner a human soul, when you strip it of family, of identity, of freedom, you create one of two things: a broken vessel or a weapon. The Beauforts believed they had destroyed her. But Eleanor was beginning to understand something terrifying. Survival was its own kind of power. To live inside the cage meant she could study it. To be bound by the machine meant she could learn its rhythms, and somewhere in the depths of her silence, a new calculation was forming. This is where most tellings of the Beaufort story stop, with the grotesque marriage certificate, the scandalous union of daughter and father. They whisper the fact, shake their heads, and move on. But that's the surface. The deeper truth is that the marriage was not the end. It was the beginning of a far darker game. Because once Silas secured her body and her name, Eleanor began to do the unthinkable. She began to plan, and if you're listening closely, you'll realize this is the pivot point. The moment when victimhood calcifies into resolve. The moment when a stolen heiress, raised as prey, begins to see herself not as property, but as weapon. Remember this. Power never destroys itself willingly. It takes an inside force, someone who knows its weaknesses, its blind spots. Eleanor was now inside the heart of the machine, and though she wore the mask of a bride, inside her mind, the fire was reigniting. So stay with me, because the next step in this descent is not just about what Silas did to Eleanor. It's about what Eleanor began to do in return. The newspapers printed the marriage announcement with stiff politeness, burying it between reports of cotton prices and steamship arrivals. A union between Silas Beaufort and his adopted daughter. No outrage, no scandal. Charleston society knew when to keep its mouth shut. Power buys silence, and silence is the soil where corruption thrives. But inside the Beaufort mansion, the silence was of another kind. Heavy, stifling. Eleanor lived in two worlds at once. The public mask of a docile bride and the private reality of a captive. Yet something inside her had hardened. She was no longer the trembling girl who signed the certificate. She was studying, watching, waiting. Every dynasty has its cracks. Eleanor learned to see them. She noticed how Silas trusted only a handful of men with his accounts, and how those men resented his control. She saw how Charles, his son, drank too heavily and spoke too freely when the bottle was low. She heard whispers among the servants, coded complaints about supplies missing from the storehouse, debts unpaid, strangers visiting at night. Each fragment was nothing alone, but together they mapped the outline of a secret empire propped up by fraud and fear. Eleanor began to play her role with precision. At disease, manners, she laughed when expected. At church, she lowered her eyes. To the outside world, she was the picture of submission. But behind closed doors, she returned to the archives whenever she could, slipping coins into Hartwell's palm to pull another record, another deed, another proof of what had been stolen. She smuggled these fragments back to the mansion, hiding them in the lining of her dresses, beneath loose floorboards in her chamber. Piece by piece, she was reconstructing the truth of her inheritance. But information wasn't enough. She needed leverage, and leverage required patience. That patience paid off one humid summer night in 1856. Silas was away on business near Savannah, and Charles stumbled into the library half-drunk, muttering about ledgers and debts. Eleanor followed. From the shadows of the doorway, she watched him pull a volume from the shelf, not a book, but a hollowed ledger, thick with slips of paper. She saw numbers, signatures, names of creditors. She saw receipts for payments that had never been recorded in the official accounts. Charles didn't notice her. He poured himself another glass, shoved the ledger back into place, and left the room. Eleanor waited until the house was quiet, then returned. Her hands trembled as she slid the ledger from the shelf and opened it by candlelight. What she found confirmed everything. Forged contracts transferring Ravenel lands into Beaufort hands, letters instructing arsonists to finish the work before harvest, payments to officials who had conveniently lost court filings. The entire Ravenel extinction laid bare in ink. This was no longer suspicion, it was proof. For hours she sat there, reading by the flicker of wax, her fear slowly transforming into something colder. Sharper. Rage, yes, but not the kind that burns wild and blind. This was a rage that calculates, that waits, that sharpens itself like a blade. When dawn broke, Eleanor slid the ledger back into its hiding place. She told no one, not yet. To act too soon would be suicide. Silas had spent decades building a fortress of influence. To topple him required more than truth. It required timing. So Eleanor played the part. She smiled at the table. She hosted soirees. She endured the grotesque performance of marriage, all the while keeping her secret arsenal of documents close. And quietly, she began to build alliances, first with Hartwell, then with a young attorney named James Calder, a man with a reputation for honesty sharp enough to be dangerous in Charleston. She never told them everything, just enough to keep their interest alive, just enough to test who could be trusted. This is where Eleanor's story shifts from tragedy into something far more unsettling, because what she became inside the Beaufort household was not simply a victim plotting escape. She was transforming into a strategist. She began to understand the machine from the inside, not only as prey, but as potential predator. And here's the question you need to ask yourself as you follow her. At what point does survival become complicity? At what point does resistance blur into the very manipulation you seek to destroy? Eleanor was walking that line, and once you step onto that path, there is no way back. Because the deeper she went, the more she realized destroying Silas Beaufort would not just mean reclaiming her inheritance. It would mean mastering the very weapons he had used against her. Lies, leverage, control. That is the paradox of power. To kill the machine, sometimes you must learn to operate it. And Eleanor Ravenel, child of ashes, bride of fire, was learning fast. It began with whispers. Not the whispered prayers of servants in candlelit quarters, nor the whispered gossip of Charleston drawing rooms. No, these whispers were Eleanor's own, seeded deliberately, like poisoned crumbs left for rats to follow. She had the ledger now, the proof of arson and fraud. But proof alone was not enough. Silas Beaufort's empire wasn't built on truth. It was built on perception, reputation, fear. If Eleanor moved too soon, if she flung the ledger into the light, it would be her word against his. The Charleston elite would rally to him, not her. Power defends itself. Always. So, she began to play his game. Her first move was small, almost invisible. At supper one evening, with Silas at the head of the table and Charles drinking heavily at his side, Eleanor mentioned, in passing, that she had overheard a curious remark in town, someone suggesting that the Ravenel lands had never properly changed hands. She spoke it with feigned naivete, as though it were nothing more than idle chatter, then smiled and turned the conversation to the weather. But she saw the way Silas's fork froze halfway to his mouth. She saw the flicker in his eyes, quick and sharp, like a blade catching light. He said nothing. Yet in that silence, Eleanor knew her words had struck. The seed had been planted. The next move came weeks later during one of Silas's absences. Eleanor invited James Calder, the young attorney she had cautiously sounded out, to the mansion under pretense of reviewing church donations. In the privacy of her chamber, she slipped him a single page from the ledger, a forged deed transferring Ravenel acreage to the Beaufort name. She did not give him the whole book, only a fragment, enough to inflame his curiosity, but not enough to implicate herself. Calder's face paled as he read. "This is fraud of the highest order," he whispered, but Eleanor pressed a finger to her lips. "Not yet," she warned. "The walls have ears." She sent him away with the page hidden in his coat, knowing full well he would not sleep until he uncovered more. Another seed planted. Then came the servants. Eleanor understood them better than Silas ever could. To him they were invisible. To her they were the nervous system of the house, listening, remembering, carrying fragments of truth from room to room. She began to reward their small confessions. A coin here, a smile there, a promise whispered in the dark. Soon they were telling her things Silas never imagined she could know. Which guests he received after midnight, which letters he burned in the fireplace, which shipments arrived at the docks under false names. Every secret she gathered became another thread, and Eleanor was weaving those threads into a net. But the most dangerous move was yet to come. In October of 1856, Silas hosted a grand dinner to celebrate a new shipment of rice bound for England. The house glittered with chandeliers, violins sang in the parlor, Glasses of brandy clinked. But Eleanor had arranged something special. She knew Charles would drink too much. He always did. She knew, too, that in his drunkenness he liked to boast. So, hours before the guests arrived, Eleanor whispered to him a casual remark about how some townspeople still doubted the accidental fire that claimed the Ravenels. She feigned worry. "I hope they don't think it had anything to do with us." Then she let silence hang, watching the alcohol already softening his edges. That night, before 50 witnesses, Charles Beaufort slurred his way through a toast, and in his stupor he laughed about the fire, laughed about how father always gets what he wants, laughed about the Ravenel land being taken care of. The room froze. Guests shifted uncomfortably. Silas's face turned the color of coal. Eleanor, ever the dutiful bride, pressed a hand to her lips as though shocked. But inside, she was smiling. The trap had sprung. From that night forward, rumors spread like rot. Whispers of arson, whispers of fraud. The Beaufort name was no longer untouchable, and Silas knew that the spark had come from within his own house. But he could not accuse her outright, not yet. To expose Eleanor would be to expose himself. And so the game continued, silent and deadly, two predators circling in the same cage. Here is the horror you must recognize. Eleanor was no longer merely surviving. She was becoming what Silas had taught her to be. Patient, ruthless, calculating. In learning the language of power, she had begun to speak it fluently, and that is the paradox of her story. The prey was turning into predator, but in doing so, she was inching closer to the very thing she despised. The question that haunts us now is not whether Eleanor would destroy Silas. It is whether, in the end, she would also destroy herself. Silas Beaufort had ruled for decades because he knew one truth most men refuse to accept. The real enemy is not the mob at the gates, but the whisper in the dark. And now, for the first time, the whisper lived inside his own house. After the disastrous dinner, when Charles's drunken tongue spilled too much, Silas did not rage. He did not strike the boy or denounce Eleanor. He simply smiled through clenched teeth, raised his glass, and steered the conversation back to commerce. Guests departed uneasy, but no louder words were spoken. Yet when the doors closed, when only family remained in the echoing hall, a storm gathered in silence. Charles slumped unconscious over the table. Margaret, feverish in her bed, muttered half-coherent warnings no one heeded, and Silas stood at the head of the long dining table, fingers gripping the carved mahogany like a general weighing casualties after a lost skirmish. His empire had cracks. His son had betrayed him with loose words. His reputation had shifted ever so slightly in the eyes of Charleston society. But Silas was no ordinary man. He had survived financial panics, epidemics, hurricanes that wiped entire plantations from the earth. He would not be undone by a girl, his own adopted daughter turned reluctant bride. So he began to watch her. He noticed things he had once overlooked. The way she lingered at the servants' quarters longer than necessary, the way she excused herself from gatherings under the pretense of illness, only to vanish for hours, the way she held her gaze too firmly when he questioned her, as if rehearsing courage she did not feel. And then there was James Calder, the attorney who appeared too often under too many convenient pretexts. Silas knew the look of a man caught in another's orbit, the stiff posture, the careful phrasing. Calder was not serving the Beauforts, he was serving Eleanor. Silas played the fool. He welcomed Calder into the house, poured him brandy, asked his opinion on trivial contracts. He even joked about Eleanor's schoolgirl fascination with law and property. All the while he was baiting the man, letting him believe he moved unseen, because Silas was already setting his trap. One evening, Eleanor returned to her chamber to find a letter resting on her pillow. No seal, no signature, just her name written in a hand she recognized as Charles's. The contents chilled her blood. "I know what you've been doing. If Father knew, you would not live another week. Meet me at the river landing tomorrow at midnight, or I tell him everything." For hours, Eleanor sat in silence, the candle guttering low. Was it true? Did Charles know? Or had Silas forced him to write it? Either way, it reeked of a snare. At midnight she went anyway, cloaked and silent. The river landing lay silver beneath the moon, Spanish moss swaying like tattered curtains. Charles was there, unsteady, a flask in hand. His eyes darted nervously and his voice slurred. He accused her of turning the town against them, of consorting with enemies, of plotting against the family that had saved her from the ashes. But Eleanor saw it, the shadows behind the boathouse. A tall figure, silent, watching. Silas. Charles was not blackmailing her. He was bait. The real trap was to force her into admission, to catch her in words that would damn her. Eleanor's heart pounded, but she remembered the lessons Silas himself had taught her. Never show fear, never admit weakness, never answer the question being asked. Instead, she feigned innocence, wept convincingly, accused Charles of cruelty, and fled before Silas could step forward. That night, for the first time, Eleanor understood that the war was no longer hidden. It was open, though unspoken, a duel fought not with pistols at dawn, but with perception, with secrets, with the silent maneuverings of two predators locked in the same cage. And Silas, though he had miscalculated, was not finished. Within days, rumors shifted again. Suddenly, it was Eleanor who was whispered about in Charleston parlors. Some claimed she had been seen meeting Calder in secret. Others claimed she had written letters casting suspicion on her own husband. The tide of gossip was turning, and Eleanor knew whose hand stirred it. Silas was moving faster now, desperate to isolate her. But isolation breeds clarity, and Eleanor was no longer the trembling orphan clutching a burned doll. She had fire of her own now, and she would not wait passively for Silas to strike again. For in that moment of entrapment by the river, she had seen something in his eyes, a flicker of doubt, a calculation interrupt. Ed. Silas, for all his power, was beginning to fear her, and fear, once seeded in a tyrant's heart, grows like rot until it consumes everything. Fear corrodes empires from within. Silas Beaufort had wielded it for decades, over rivals, over his family, even over Charleston itself. But when fear turned inward, when the patriarch himself began to feel it gnaw at the edges of his certainty, the balance shifted. Eleanor saw the tremor in his hand as he poured wine. She heard the catch in his breath when her eyes lingered too long on his. For the first time, the lion doubted his dominion. That was her opening. Eleanor knew she could not meet him head-on. Men like Silas did not fall to frontal assault. They were too entrenched, too shielded by wealth and allies. To destroy him, she would need to erode him from the inside out, the way the sea eats cliffs, relentless, invisible, inevitable. She began with his allies. The Beaufort name was stitched into the fabric of Charleston. Investors, judges, merchants, pastors, all tangled in his web. But Eleanor had something Silas did not, the ability to appear harmless. He was a patriarch. She was a dutiful wife. No one suspected the viper curled beneath her smile. At a church luncheon, she leaned close to Mrs. Rutledge, wife of the county sheriff, and whispered just loudly enough for others to overhear. "It's strange, isn't it, how the Ravenel wills disappeared after the fire? Father always told me they'd left everything to me." She let the words hang, then laughed it off, as if it were foolish girlishness. But the seed was planted. Within days it sprouted into murmurs that the Beaufort wealth rested on contested land. At another gathering, she lingered near a cluster of merchants discussing debts. She sighed, feigned concern, and murmured, "I pray the banks remain patient with Silas. He's been so strained lately, I worry for his health." The men exchanged glances. If a man's wife spoke of failing health and strained finances, was it not true? Each seed was small, but Eleanor scattered them wide. By the time James Calder quietly circulated select pages of the ledger, those she had fed him strategically, the whispers became currents. The Beaufort Empire, once a fortress, began to look like a facade held up by rotting beams. Silas sensed the shift. Invitations declined. Bankers hesitated. Old allies grew cautious. Yet he did not rage in public. He doubled down on control within the house. Eleanor found her movements shadowed, her letters intercepted, her conversations interrupted by Charles or a servant suddenly appearing. But every restriction only deepened her resolve. The boldest strike came one winter night when Eleanor requested a private audience with Judge Marion, one of Charleston's most powerful legal figures and a longtime Beaufort ally. She did not accuse Silas outright. That would have been suicide. Instead, she placed a single document on his desk, a copy of a Ravenel deed, signed and sealed, but with dates that did not match the courthouse records. She asked no favors, Was it she only said, "If something should happen to me, I pray this will find its way to truth." Then she left. The judge was shaken. Eleanor knew it. Word spread quietly through Charleston that the Beaufort holdings might not be as secure as they appeared. For men of influence, uncertainty is poison. But power games are never one-sided. Silas struck back in kind. Suddenly, whispers about Eleanor herself grew darker. Some said she had taken a lover. Calder's name was never spoken, but implied. Others claimed she was unstable, still haunted by the fire, prone to hysteria. And in a society where a woman's reputation was as fragile as glass, such whispers could be as lethal as daggers. Yet Eleanor did not flinch. She understood now what Silas had always known. Reputation was war, and war demanded sacrifice. If she must let her own name be dragged through the mud to corrode his empire, so be it. But there was one battlefield left untouched: the family itself. Charles, weak and pliable. Victoria, silent but observant. Margaret, half-mad yet clutching truths in her fevered mind. Eleanor realized she could not only turn Charleston against Silas, she could turn his blood against him. And so, as winter deepened and the nights grew longer, Eleanor began whispering not in the parlors of Charleston, but in the corridors of her own house. Planting doubt, planting division, planting the one thing Silas could never withstand: betrayal from within. Because in the end, even tyrants fall. But they fall hardest when the blade comes from their own table. It started with small fractures, hairline cracks in a dynasty that had presented itself as unbreakable marble for generations. But marble is brittle. It splinters under pressure. Eleanor knew this. Silas knew it too, but too late. Charles was the easiest to touch. His loyalty to his father was real, but it was brittle, softened by drink and envy. Charles had always wanted to prove himself, yet Silas kept him tethered like a boy, never granting him true authority. Eleanor used that. She found him one evening in the library, hunched over a glass, his face flushed. She sat across from him, her voice soft, confessional. "Do you ever feel as though your father doesn't trust you?" she asked. He bristled. Of course he did. Silas never let him sign papers without oversight, never let him negotiate with bankers alone. Eleanor let silence do the work. Then she murmured, almost too quietly, "I've seen the books. I know how bad the debts are, and yet he tells you nothing. He keeps you in the dark, Charles, because he fears you might see how much he's lost." Charles said nothing, but the next night she found his glass already full, his eyes already heavy. He was thinking. Doubt was there now, and doubt is a poison that spreads. Victoria was more difficult. She had her father's composure, his cold watchfulness, yet Eleanor had noticed something: Victoria's quiet resentment at being overlooked, treated as a piece on the marriage market rather than an heir of her own right. Eleanor approached her not as rival, but as sister. One afternoon, she placed a hand over Victoria's as they embroidered together. "If this house falls, it will be because father never trusted his daughters," she whispered. Victoria's hand stilled. Eleanor leaned closer. "Men inherit names, but women inherit memory. And memory, Victoria, is more dangerous than wealth." For the first time, Victoria looked at her not with suspicion, but with curiosity. A seed, planted. And Margaret, poor Margaret. She was a ruin of a woman, drifting in and out of lucidity, her body failing under years of strange sickness. But in her moments of clarity, she spoke truths the others dared not. One night, Eleanor sat at her bedside, and Margaret gripped her wrist with surprising strength. "It was him!" she hissed, eyes wide with fevered intensity. "The fire, the poison, the lies. Silas did it all." Her voice cracked into sobs, but Eleanor soothed her, whispered back, "Then let us finish what you could not." She wasn't sure Margaret even understood, but when servants overheard, when they whispered of what Margaret had said, it no longer mattered whether the words were truth or madness. The story took on its own life. Inside the Beaufort mansion, suspicion now walked the halls like a living shadow. Charles grew curt with his father, sulking when denied even minor decisions. Victoria withdrew, her eyes calculating, her questions sharper. Margaret muttered curses at Silas in her half-dreaming states, and all the while, Eleanor kept her mask. The dutiful wife, the grieving orphan, the silent observer. Silas saw it happening. He felt the walls close. His children's eyes no longer glowed with loyalty. They glowed with doubt. He still held the ledges, the lands, the name. But names mean nothing when your own blood begins to question them. One night, he confronted Eleanor in the study. The room was dark but for a single lamp, shadows draped across his lined face. "You think you are clever," he said, voice low, controlled. "But I made you. Without me, you are nothing. Without me, you would have died in the ashes with your parents." Eleanor met his gaze. Her voice was steady, cold. "Perhaps. But without me, your house will devour itself. Look at your children. Look at your wife. They are already slipping from your grasp. And I haven't even begun." For the first time, Silas's mask cracked. Not with rage, but with something far worse. Fear. He had ruled his world through control, through silence, through manipulation. But Eleanor had turned those weapons against him, and in doing so, she had created a force he could not easily contain. His own blood was slipping from him, grain by grain, like sand through a dying man's hands. And here is the cruelest truth. When empires fall, they do not collapse from enemy cannons. They collapse because the foundation rots and the walls cave inward. Silas Beaufort's foundation was rotting, and Eleanor was the one holding the torch. His collapse came slowly. Then all at once, Charleston society, ever attuned to weakness, smelled blood. Invitations to dinners and balls that once arrived daily for the Beauforts dwindled to none. Bankers who had always deferred to Silas began requesting collateral he could not produce. His name, once spoken with reverence, was now whispered in parlors with smirks, and beneath the grand roof of the Beaufort mansion the family itself had become a nest of quiet betrayals. Charles drank deeper. One night, in a drunken fury, he shouted at his father across the dining table, "You've built nothing but lies!" The servants heard it. They carried the tale to the town. Silas struck him, but the damage was already done. A son who denounced his father in public was a death blow to reputation. Victoria moved with silence and calculation, writing letters Eleanor never saw, cultivating alliances of her own. Eleanor had awakened her, and now the daughter plotted her own ascension, not as her father's pawn, but as his rival. Margaret, slipping further into illness, no longer hid her ravings. She accused Silas by name, in front of guests, of murder and fraud. Whether madness or revelation, no one could be certain, but the words lodged in the minds of those who heard them. And through it all, Eleanor remained poised, the dutiful wife, the grieving orphan, the quiet flame that warmed when needed and froze when required. She let Silas rage. She let him slam doors, tear up letters, shout commands that fewer and fewer obeyed. Every outburst only confirmed the portrait she had painted of him, an old man clinging to power he no longer truly possessed. The climax arrived in spring. Judge Marion convened a discreet but decisive inquiry into Beaufort property claims. Not a trial, not yet, but an audit. An insult for a man of Silas's stature. He stormed into the chamber, demanded respect, slammed his cane against the floor. And when he emerged hours later, his face was gray. For the first time, Charleston had not bent to him. His accounts would be frozen pending review, his lands questioned, his empire shackled. That night, the mansion echoed with silence. No servants hovered, no children gathered. Silas sat alone in the study, staring at the ledges that had once been his throne. Eleanor entered without knocking. He looked up at her, and for a moment he was not the Titan of Charleston, but an old man, weary, cornered. "You've done this," he whispered. She did not deny it. She only stepped closer, her eyes steady. "No, you did this. I only showed them the truth." Silas's hand trembled on the cane, his breath rattled. And for one terrible second, Eleanor thought he might strike her, even kill her, but he didn't. He only sagged deeper into his chair, broken. It would have been easy then for her to end him outright, to take the final piece of his power. But Eleanor was no longer the trembling girl he had tried to shape. She had learned something in her war against him. Power is not taken with a blade. It is taken with memory, with reputation, with silence that speaks louder than screams. The next morning, Charleston awoke to the news. Silas Beaufort was dead. Some said apoplexy, others whispered poison. No physician could agree, and Eleanor never said. She wore black, veiled her face, and stood at the head of his funeral procession, the perfect widow. And when the dust settled, when the Beaufort estate was divided, when creditors circled and allies chose sides, who remained standing? Not Charles, who drowned in his vices. Not Victoria, whose ambition had outrun her leverage. Not Margaret, who wasted away within months. It was Eleanor, she, the orphan, the outsider, the girl dragged from the ashes. She who had endured his grip, his schemes, his empire of shadows. She who had turned his own weapons against him. And Charleston, ever practical, accepted her. The whispers shifted. Poor Eleanor. How strong she has been after such tragedy. How noble, how composed. Truly she is the rightful guardian of what remains. In the end, Silas had been right about one thing. He had made her, but not into the obedient wife he had intended. He had made her into his mirror, sharpened by fire and tempered by cruelty. And so the Beaufort dynasty did not end. It simply changed hands. Eleanor's hands,